As a regenerative consultant, managing pH is one of the first things we do when working with clients to improve their soil health and plant health. So this is my complete guide to regenerating acidic soils. So we'll go over the root cause of soil acidity, why it could be a massive problem on your farm, and then the ways we fix acidic soils regeneratively. So soil acidity is the amount of hydrogen ions in your soil. So there's two components. The first one is the amount of hydrogen in your soil solution. So this is the water component. And the other component is the amount of hydrogen actually on your clay or humic colloid. And so typically this is measured in pH, which refers to the power of hydrogen, but more specifically in chemistry, it is the negative log of the concentration of hydrogen. So ultimately it is the concentration of hydrogen within your soil. So the more hydrogen you have, the lower this number is going to be because it's a negative log. And so typically pH is measured somewhere between 0 and 14. In soil, it's typically going to be maybe between 4 and 9. And so the ideal pH for your soil is roughly around 6.5. Now it depends on your crop. Some crops like potatoes like slightly more acidic soils, but typically if you can hit that 6.5, that's very good. Anything below that 6.5 is becoming more and more acidic. And once you hit a pH of 5.5, that's when it starts to become a limiting factor potentially. And so once it hits that, that's kind of an activation number to go, hey, we might need to start fixing this or taking different actions. So within the soil, there's things called colloids. Colloids are negatively charged plates or components in your soil. And so typically your colloids are made up of either clays or soil organic matter. And so it's a negative size on those. Positively charged particles in the soil called cations or elements like to stick to that colloid. And so you can see here we have all our main cations. We have calcium, magnesium, sodium, potassium, hydrogen, and aluminium. Now, aluminium is technically what's called an acidic cation because once this dissolves into the water, it reacts with the water within the soil to then further release more hydrogen. So to start off, we have the two components of soil acidity. We have exchangeable hydrogen, which represents the amount of hydrogen actually stuck to the clay colloid. And then we have our active hydrogen. So our active hydrogen is really the hydrogen within the soil solution. And so both of these contribute to the overall acidity of the soil. In order for it to not be acidic, you need to have a low amount of acidity in both of these pools. When we measure pH, we can use two different extractions. We can use water extraction, which takes typically this component, or a calcium chloride, which considers more or less both. So that's all pH is. It's just where are these hydrogen ions and the amount of them. The tricky part is actually managing for that and getting into the different methodologies of doing that. So now that we know what soil acidity means, and it's simply just the concentration of these hydrogen, let's discuss why it's actually there. And so there's a few main factors as to why these hydrogen are here. The first one is that it's from the parent material. And so typically in granite type soils, you're going to get more hydrogen. That's just the way the parent material is. In more basalt soils, you're going to get less. That's the first one. The breakdown of some of the parent material can contribute to pH. Now there's nothing you can really do about that except manage it because you can't do anything about your parent material unless you want to move farms. The next component is adding hydrogen to the system. So when we think about how do we actually get this hydrogen here? There's two main ways that it can get there. The first one are the products that we actually apply, so our inputs. This largely comes down to our nitrogen applications. So nitrogen we either get as ammonium or nitrate. So these are the two big components when looking at our fertiliser inputs or the nitrogen sources. We also have urea, which initially enters in as ammonium and then typically gets converted into nitrate. Now as a general rule of thumb, ammonium is acidifying. So if you look here, we've got hydrogen. If this is taken up by the plant, typically the plant has to release a hydrogen ion, which we'll talk about that in a moment because it's the second way of the hydrogen getting in, but it has to release a hydrogen ion to then pick up or keep that a neutral charge. So it releases a hydrogen ion to then pick up a positively charged cation. Or this ammonium then gets converted into nitrate. In order for it to get converted into nitrate, there's a few steps that is required in that. But the overall process actually releases two hydrogen ions plus water, so H2O. You can see there's 4 hydrogen here, and then there's 4 hydrogen as an output, and that gets converted into nitrate. So from here, we've just released hydrogen into the system. So as a general rule of thumb, ammonium-based fertilizers tend to acidify the soil, likewise with urea. even though there's an initial increase in pH, because technically it converts into ammonia first and then ammonium, and that requires the addition of hydrogen to the ammonia to get converted into ammonium. But in the end, it releases more if it then gets converted into nitrate before going into the plant. Now, if this nitrate doesn't get used by the plant, it will either leach into the subsoil. Typically what happens with this is that it drags down other cations with it. So it might drag down your calcium, potassium, magnesium, things that you actually want. That's not very good. The risk with this is that then your hydrogen can then take up that place and increase the amount of hydrogen on your colloid. The other component is that nitrate can then actually get converted into nitrogen gas, and that system actually increases the pH of the soil. So the oxygen here gets released typically as hydroxide. And so to rank our nitrogen fertilizers on a scale from not acidifying to very acidifying, typically what we get are our nitrates at the top. So anything with a nitrate to it, so potassium nitrate or calcium nitrate, that tends to not be acidifying. Likewise, the other component is chicken manure. So chicken manure tends to have a neutral effect, doesn't affect pH. Below that, what has a slightly acidifying effect is urea, as well as ammonium nitrate. And so you get both ammonium and nitrate in that one. Below this is DAP, which is an ammonium-based fertilizer. Below that we have MAP, as well as ammonium sulfate on the same level as that. And so even though I tend to prefer ammonium-based fertilizers from the plant physiology point of view, because it doesn't have that many steps to convert, it's important to note that this will be acidifying your soil if you're applying it especially to your soil, and that can be a problem. You can buffer a lot of this with carbon, but the overall effect is going to be acidifying your soil. Simply, you're just adding hydrogen, and you can't quite get around that. So that's one really big source of hydrogen and cause of acidity, which is simply the fertilizer choices we use. The other way we get soil acidity is through root extradation of hydrogen ions. And so the way this works is that on the clay colloid, if the plant wants to take off, say, calcium or magnesium or potassium, it needs to balance that pH. And so the plant will release a hydrogen ion to then substitute with the calcium or the cation, so that it then pushes off that cation and the plant can absorb it. A combination of both of these means that the soil tends to acidify. And so the problem with acidic soils is that it really affects the availability of a lot of our minerals. So you can see here in a chart of the different mineral availabilities at different pHs. Typically, you get a decrease of a lot of minerals past 5.5, and you get an increased availability in aluminium, which is quite toxic to the plant, as well as manganese. Now, you want manganese in a good supply, but once it starts to get too acidic, it actually increases the supply way too much and can be quite toxic to the plant. Once you get past that 5.5, it can start to really limit the availability of a lot of minerals. Likewise, once you start getting below that 5.5, microbial activity starts to decrease and roots start to become stunted. And so when you think about, if we want to develop really big root systems, we don't want to have a lot of acidity in the soil, because otherwise your plants are just going to be stunted and not having that massive root system. So if we want to measure the acidity of our soil, which is basically the amount of hydrogen there is, we can use both the pH, and that gives us a really good estimate on the active hydrogen in our soil, but not necessarily the amount of hydrogen ions. And so what we like to do is we use the percent of hydrogen on the clay colloid. What this is if you added up the amount of space that the hydrogen ions take up on the colloid and work it out as a percentage. And so that tells us how big the problem is and how much effectively empty space there is on our colloid. What we can use for this is what's called base saturation. Base saturation is the inverse of that, or the opposite of that. It's the percent of base cations, sodium, magnesium, calcium, and potassium on the clay colloid. Since aluminium and hydrogen both cause a hydrogen in the soil, these you can call acidic cations. So what we're really looking for is to have a base saturation between 90 in a sandy soil to about 95 in a clay soil. This difference is effectively what that hydrogen and aluminium makes up. Now, one other thing to mention is that legumes tend to release more hydrogen. They tend to be more acidifying. So it means that if you're in a very acidic soil, not a good idea to include a lot of legumes in your cover crops, or just grow legumes in general. They are beneficial because they produce nitrogen, but they also acidify the soil. They have a very high calcium requirement. That's just something important to consider. Cool, so now that we understand this, let's get into how we like to manage soil acidity for our clients and how we do that using a regenerative framework. So when we first start working with clients, we want to get a really good soil test done. What we're looking for here is to know exactly what the situation is. And so we get a total soil test done, but the totals doesn't necessarily matter. It's really we're looking for the effective cation exchange capacity, because we want to know how big the soil is, we want to know the pH, and we also want to know the percent of those hydrogen actually making up the space on the colloid. So let's say we've got this soil here, has a pH of 5.4, so getting pretty acidic. Now when it comes to the pH, ideally, let's just say this is a sandy soil, we want to get it to 6.3. Actually getting it to 6.3 is probably not going to get you an economic return with the application of lime. So what we like to do is we take a combination of a few approaches. If this is below 5.5, then we take a liming approach. If it's above, then we manage it with biology. Obviously, you can do it both ways. When it's below that 5.5, then it's, okay, we actually really need to do something, so we lime. When it's above this, or even around that, it's more of a conversation of, okay, biology can help with this, it just depends on the time frame that you're looking for and the amount of acidifying fertilizer you're going to be adding. Overall, it really depends on what you think your economic threshold is. We tend to hover around that 5.5. It's not a hard rule, but it tends to be good enough. So this is below that 5.5. So what we're going to do with this one is we're going to consider a liming application. What we want to do for this one is understand what's actually going on in the soil. So there's a few numbers we need. So we want to know our base saturation. So sometimes the labs will give you that number. Sometimes they don't. So what you can do to work this out is you add up all the base cations. So the base cations are calcium. Now your ideal percent of each of your cations will change depending on the texture of your soil. Ideally, for a sandy soil, we want calcium to be around that 60%. Not bad to have a bit more, calcium quite important. So let's just say this soil has a calcium percentage of 50%. Next one is magnesium. We're going to say this is 10%. Our potassium, we're going to say is 8%. And then our sodium, we're going to say is 2%. So to work out your base saturation, you simply just add all these up. And so that will work out to be 70. So our base saturation here is 70. When we add up the ideal levels of all of this, it works out to be around 90. Now on our soil test, we get the effective cation exchange capacity. We're going to say for this one, the effective cation exchange capacity is about 6, which is in centimoles per kilo. So what we're saying is that the base saturation makes up 80% of the colloids. We want that at 90%. So the rest of that is really either hydrogen, which is acidity, or aluminium, which is also produces hydrogen because it reacts with water and therefore creates acidity. So when looking at this, we go, okay, pH is telling us that there's a problem. The base saturation is telling us there's a problem in terms of the amount of hydrogen that actually is on our colloids. So that's the first step. We actually need to figure out this math. You can do that for free using our soil test calculator, but you need to make sure you have a good soil test for that. So now that we got this, what we like to do, and because it's below our threshold number, is either a liming application or dolomite application. Now the way to work this out is you take the difference between here. We've got 20 percentage points of hydrogen in excess, which means we need to supply enough lime to firstly displace this hydrogen and then neutralize it, in addition to this hydrogen here. In order to do that, there's a few calculations we need to do. The first one is we need to work out how many centimoles per kilo does this actually take up, and then convert that into effective a liming equivalent. Now it's important that it is a liming equivalent. We don't want to use, say, calcium chloride, because that doesn't actually neutralize the hydrogen. The way to neutralize hydrogen is that this needs to react with a hydroxide ion. And so if we have our hydrogen here, it needs to react with a hydroxide, which is that. They come together to form water, H2O, and the H2O is neutral. We need to add enough hydroxide ions in order for all this to be neutralized. The way any liming material works, now this can be lime, it could be dolomite, anything with a carbonate, is that we have a carbonate. So the carbonate then reacts with 2 lots of hydrogen to form carbon dioxide and water, H2O. And so this way, we get our water there, carbon dioxide then leaves, and we effectively have neutralized our hydrogen. So we need to make sure we're supplying both cations to liberate the hydrogen ion off our colloid, as well as supply the carbonate here to then neutralize the hydrogen. So the question is how much? So if we have 20% hydrogen that we need to get rid of, so this is what that looks like. We have the 20% that we want to get rid of our hydrogen, times that by the effective cation exchange capacity, in which case is 6, and we get left with 1.2 centimoles per kilo. And now we can convert this into effectively calcium. So for every centimole, there's about 200 grams of calcium. And so we want to times this 1.2 by 200, and we get left with 240. Let's just say we want to fix this to 10 centimeters deep with a bulk density of 1.4. Then we're really just timesing this by 1.4, which then works out to be 336 kilos of calcium per hectare. Is what we need to supply in order to displace all this hydrogen. But that's not lime. We need to convert this calcium into lime. Lime is about 40% calcium, so we can divide this by 40%, which then works out to be 840 kilos of pure lime. Now, this is pure lime. I'm applying that per hectare. So now that we have that, we can then work out how much lime or say dolomite we want to add. So now the other thing is this is pure calcium carbonate. We need to then convert that into its neutralizing value, which then considers any impurities. So typically that might be 95%. So I think that works out to be 880 kilos of, say, ag lime that you can actually apply. Now, dolomite and lime has a very similar neutralizing value. So if you want to add a bit of dolomite with that, which contains magnesium, and if you have a look over here and you want to do a bit more base saturation work, applying a bit of magnesium, especially to this soil, is quite beneficial if we want to get that to 20. So by this framework, we want to get the calcium to 60, magnesium to 20. So we're going to apply a bit more magnesium, a bit more calcium. We can work all that out later. But this is how much lime we need to add in order to displace and neutralize a lot of this hydrogen. So this method is good. It does underestimate the liming requirements, however. The most accurate way is to get the lab to do a buffering solution to know exactly how much lime you do need to apply. But I don't actually mind doing this way because it underestimates the liming requirements. The reason why that's important is because I don't want to apply too much lime because it has an oxidizing effect on the soil, which then causes a lot of other problems. So I'd rather supply less amounts of lime more frequently than a very large amount of lime in one go. Now remember, what we really need is this carbonate component to react with hydrogen. So what this means is that supplying anything other than carbonate won't fix the problem. So we can't apply gypsum because that's the calcium sulfate. It's not going to actually react with the hydrogen. Likewise, applying calcium chloride isn't going to fix the problem. What really we're after is not actually the amount of calcium on the colloid, it is the lack of hydrogen. Likewise, we don't want hydrogen in our soil solution. So it really doesn't actually have that much to do with the base saturation, but rather the amount of hydrogen on the clay colloid. So that's one method, that's applying lime to then neutralize the pH. And so if we add that up, we're going to firstly get a good soil test. But number one, we're going to effectively add lime or say dolomite. Now there's other materials out there that also have a neutralizing effect. And so what you can do is you can look up the neutralizing value of different materials and use the same, more or less same calculations. You can work it out to the liming equivalent and then go from there. Lime, dolomite are the big ones. You can also use soft rock phosphate as well. But again, you got to work out the liming requirement and then you go from there. So again, we use this if the pH is below 5.5. The reason for that is to get a bit more calcium into the system. Calcium is quite important. We always find it's difficult to actually get into the plant. But we want to add that calcium, also get a really quick, fast improvement in the soil pH, and then we can go from there. The increase in calcium will then help plant growth as well as microbial activity. So sometimes you just got to kickstart the system and get it going. What we then want to do is we want to use plant and biology to then further improve our soil health. Now this is quite interesting because you don't really hear too much information about this. And when you do hear information, it is just a trust me, plants fix pH. But giving recommendations based off of trust me is not good enough for me. I like to know exactly why things work. And so the second one is root exudates. Once we've added our lime and gotten the pH up to where we want it, we then will need to rely on healthy plants to further increase the pH of our soil. So root exudates, plants have the ability to release alkaline or basic materials in their root exudates. So the root exudates can contain bicarbonates, which is a carbonate with one hydrogen. So there's just one spot for a hydrogen to then take up. So very similar to this, except it's just one hydrogen. So plants can actually release that. And it's not a wooey thing. And so according to mineral nutrition of plants, the rhizosphere pH is impacted by plants, especially their root exudates, by up to 2 units, which means even if you had a pH of say 4, the plant can actually then increase that to 6, which is a massive increase. One of the suggested modes of action is the release of these bicarbonates. Plants can release them to increase the rhizosphere. Now the rhizosphere is only say 2 millimeters outside the root zone. So this method takes a lot longer, but with enough roots there and over multiple seasons, you can start to then increase your pH. Now there's a few other ways of root exudates increasing pH. And so the other way plants can do that is the release of organic anions, and that undergoes decarboxylation in the soil. So what this is, where you have at the end of an organic compound, you effectively have a carbolic acid component. This gets substituted with a hydrogen. So that gets wiped out, you add a hydrogen to it, which is taken up from the soil, and it turns that into something else. So that's been found to be another method of which plants can increase the soil pH. Finally, the plant can also just release alkaline material or basic material, which then neutralizes the soil environment. It absorbs these and consumes it and produces something else. So when it comes to root exudates, there's really 2 things we need to think about. The amount of root exudates produced within a time frame, that only comes from increased plant health. To increase plant health and therefore increase root exudates, the first thing we need to do is increase the photosynthetic ability of the plant. This is easiest to do with nutritional applications. So a foliar application of iron, magnesium, manganese, making sure that you have good phosphorus, all will increase the photosynthetic ability of the plant and drive root exudation. There's more, we can add more to that, like protein synthesis, but really it's photosynthesis that drives the whole thing. So foliar applications of these will help. I would take a differential sap test analysis first to know whether or not you actually need to apply those. And so that is within the time frame. The other thing we want to do is across time. So that's things like cover crops, intercropping, making sure we have photosynthesis across the whole year, not just for that crop. And I mean, if you think of wheat, you only have wheat in the ground for say 6 months or so. And so for the rest of the year, there's nothing in the ground. If we had a cover crop or we're intercropping something, then that could extend for another 2 months. And so rather than going 6 months and nothing for 6 months, we have something in the ground for 8 months, and then it's just 4 months we don't have something in the ground. The increasing root exudations of your crop have multiple benefits. It's the easiest thing to do. Cover crops can be a bit more tricky. They're quite beneficial, but again, quite tricky to do because you've got to make sure you get the establishment right, not using up too much water, and then you've got to make sure you terminate it properly. So once we get our liming application to lift the pH, add some calcium, we want to focus on root exudation for then the plant to fix the rhizosphere itself. Now, it's not just the plants, it's also microbes. So microbes can release basic material too, or alkalizing material. There's a really interesting study with bacillus bacteria. It's actually released this year. And so they found that microbes, especially the bacillus species, can release alkaline metabolites to then increase soil pH. So they found that after 35 days, they took the soil pH from 5.86 to 5.91. So not a massive increase, but that's only 35 days and without a symbiotic relationship with plants. So I would assume that with more root exudates from the plant to then feed the biology, you'd then get an even bigger response to that. So in terms of the way we manage acidic soils with our clients is that first we want to manage our lime. Make sure we just get the pH up so we're not going to be losing yield from this. We then want to be using plants and microbes to then further increase the pH effectively for free, which will then further supply nutrition to our crops. So the root exudates, really important. These 2 factors ultimately come down to 2 things. It is increasing the amount of root exudates through the photosynthetic ability of the plant, as well as making sure the microbes are there. So foliar application with our trace minerals and seed coats or a soil primer. They're really the two big strategies that would be able to increase the system. Anyway, so if that sounds interesting to you and you want to start increasing your soil pH to the ideal level and building soil health with that, what you need to do is reach out. We can sit down for a free consultation. We can work through some of this and I'll give you 5 recommendations to get you started in your regenerative journey. Awesome, thanks for watching. My name's Till. Cheers.